The Detroit River in the year 1763 during the insurrection. This map was drawn by a British military engineer. Lining the riverbank are rectangular fields of French-Canadian settlements. The Canadiens are doing their best to stay neutral, for the fort and the British Army inside are under attack. The siege is in its 80th day, and this is remarkable, for Britain is supposed to be the supreme power on the continent. From the fort ranging northeastward along the riverbank, a stream runs down to the Detroit River. It's a rivière parent, soon to be called Bloody Run. Beyond the stream is the village of the Algonquin Nation, known as the Odawa. Here lives the mastermind behind the siege of Detroit. His name is Pontiac. The British regard him as evil, as the architect of terror attacks against centers of British trade and military power. Descendant Rudy Pontiac.
I believe he attacked 7 forts in one day. The English underestimated him. They didn't believe that native people could think in war tactics. But Pontiac proved them wrong.
The British grew desperate and ruthless.
Could it not be contrived to send smallpox among the disaffected tribes of the region?
The Indian nations saw a chief turning back an arrogant empire that sought to break their power, steal their land, and crush their people. Pontiac struck back on behalf of the Algonquin Nations, but also defending the very idea of France in North America, long after France had given up the fight. This is the rebellion of Pontiac, chief of the Odawa. On the River St. Lawrence, the city of Quebec, capital of New France, seat of power for the French Empire in the Americas. The year is 1758. France is fighting a world war with England for control of the continent. The French are holding on, and one reason is help they are getting from old comrades, the Indian nations of the Great Lakes. Pontiac and his people see France as a good father, who for 2 centuries has given them respect and promoted harmony among the many tribes. Together they built the fur trade, and now together they are at war. Pontiac is a charismatic leader, speaks the Algonquin and Iroquoian languages, a little English and a lot of French. He has been summoned by the French commander-in-chief of North America, Louis-Joseph, the Marquis of Montcalm.
Pontiac. Enfin. Vous êtes le bienvenu. J'ai quelque chose pour vous. Un grand honneur de la part de Sa Majesté. Le roi de France vous est très reconnaissant d'avoir si honorablement aidé l'armée française dans sa lutte contre l'Anglais. Sa Majesté très chrétienne souhaite vous faire officier d'honneur de ses armées. Acceptez-vous?
J'accepte. Je suis fils de Louis, le demeurerai jusqu'à mon dernier souffle.
Pontiac, cher Pontiac, partagez avec moi ce vin d'honneur.
Monsieur le Marquis.
Vive le roi!
À notre père.
For centuries, sharing a glass with each other was a part of the French-Indian dialogue. But this would be the last Pontiac would share with McCallum. In a year, the British would come in boats from the St. Lawrence at Quebec, up the heights to surprise the French army on the Plains of Abraham. Montcalm dies of his wounds. The French Empire in North America is expiring. After the fall of Quebec, the coup de grâce is administered by the commander of all His British Majesty's forces in North America. On the 12th of September, 1760, Major General Geoffrey Amherst captures France's last strategic city.
I give you joy on the capture of Montreal and the whole country of Canada.
I believe never three armies, setting out from different and very distant parts from each other, joined in the center as was intended better than we did, Talia.
The journals of Amherst reveal a new attitude toward the Indian nations, radically different from the French, whose vast domain he now claims for England.
Inform Moncton that I'm sending Rogers to take the surrender of the French forts of Michilimackinac and Detroit. And be sure as to make no arrangements with the savages, as idle, a good-for-nothing crew there never was.
The man sent to take the surrender of the French forts across the Great Lakes region is Robert Rogers, an unusual soldier. To fight the French and their Indian allies, he founded a ranger battalion to engage the enemy Indian style. There is an emphasis on reconnaissance and sudden ambushes, whether tracking the French or hunting game to feed his men. On his way to take the surrender of Fort Detroit, it is Rogers who is surprised.
What are you doing in this country? Without my permission.
France is defeated.
Impossible. They are still in Detroit, and everywhere in my country.
I have come to take the French out of your country. They have been an obstacle on our way to mutual peace and commerce. Tell your warriors to mind their fathers, the French, no more. For they are all prisoners of your brothers, the English.
We shall see.
The French may have been beaten, but the multitude of Indian nations have never been conquered. In the Great Lakes region, they form a confederation of mostly Algonquin people. If there are forts stretching up through the land and waterways, it is because the masters of the territory, the Indian people, allow it. It is a business arrangement, a kind of lease. Pontiac is polite and diplomatic, but makes clear to the English who is in control.
What about settlers?
No new settlers are welcome, but English traders in the army can come and go. In return, the Indian people expect rent, diplomatic gifts, services at the forts, extra food in hard times, and plenty of ammunition for hunting.
He assured me that he was inclined to live peaceably with the English while they used him as he deserved, but intimated if they treated him with neglect, he would shut up the way and exclude them. In short, he was far from considering himself a conquered prince.
The warning from Pontiac and the Algonquin Nations was vivid and clear. But whites on the frontier were not confident the peril was understood back at headquarters. Staten Island in the British colony of New York, the 25th of October, 1761. This is England's military headquarters for all of North America, and on this day, all is right with the world. It is going to be a day of crowning glory for the Englishmen who conquered North America, and who did not see the trouble coming, even as wise men tried to warn him.
Well, Sir William writes that it is very necessary that the commanding officer of every post have it in his power to supply the Indians in case of necessity with a little clothing.
I do not see why the crown should be put to that expense.
And some arms and ammunition to hunt with, as well as a smith to repair their arms and working utensils.
Services must always be rewarded. It has always been a maxim with me.
The crown is ready to reward you, sir.
But as to purchasing the good behavior either of Indians or any others is what I do not understand. When men of whatsoever race behave ill, they must be punished, not bribed. Ah, Monckton, ah, my good man, how very good of you to stand in for our sovereign.
This is the first presentation of a royal distinction ever given in America. This gives me great pleasure.
For his conquest of Canada, General Amherst is being rewarded by his king.
In recognition of your outstanding service to the crown,
He has done all that England commanded on the battlefield. But even as he receives his knighthood, now he must secure the peace.
arise, Sir Geoffrey.
General salute! Present! Arms!
Sir Geoffrey has made a dramatic gesture in one important domain, one that is diplomatic and conciliatory.
Shoulder! Arms!
Aware of the need to win over the French in Canada, he has drawn in the elite, promising to guarantee French property and religion in exchange for allegiance to the crown. He speaks French and likes the people, so it is not a difficult gesture.
Thank you, Monckton. Gentlemen, the king.
But Sir Geoffrey wouldn't dream of making similar concessions toward the Indian people.
Ah. Fleeing like the savages.
Sir Geoffrey will not be drinking with them. One of his first acts is to ban the selling of liquor to Indians. Far and wide, the orders go out. They are far-reaching, forbidding the sale of rum, but also restricting the amount of ammunition that could be sold to Indians. At British posts like Fort Niagara, the Indians are told of the new Amherst policy, aimed to weaken them militarily and create sober citizens. They leave without rum. The drug as important to them as beer to the British or wine to the French. But more critically, they leave deprived of enough ammunition to hunt and feed their families. A spirit of rebellion began to spread among desperate Indian nations of the Great Lakes.
Gwe, does it do yet? Huh?
Joren saga, ya, the Yankee, Poniesta. Onere, Awun Yawate, Yehudiha, Awunsa. Onanine, Yensi, De Wahawi, Awunsa.
Agwegum gegatogaske. Sugwania o selune. Me unwe ladiksau gunha. Doga sagoya dagen ladiksau gunha.
Negotiations to end the 7 Years' War are still ongoing in Europe. Pontiac's people are hearing tantalizing stories that all is not lost. Rumors the French might return. On the frontier, French-Canadian fur traders also want the old order restored. They tell Pontiac what he wants to hear.
Les Anglais vous affament pour que vous ne soyez pas assez fort pour leur résister. Ils ont l'intention de vous éliminer et de prendre la terre
bientôt, tous les Anglais seront des prisonniers. Ton père, le roi de France, dormait. Maintenant, il s'est réveillé. Une grande armée viendra. Avant longtemps, elle aura repris Québec et Montréal et tout ton pays.
Indian people knew nothing of siege warfare, the tactics needed to take a fort by storm. For that, Pontiac needed the French, and now he was sure they were coming. Charlie Myers is from the Odawa Nation, a descendant of the Pontiac band.
His big thing was that the French were coming. The French were going to come up from Louisiana, up the Mississippi, and help him, or come down from the St. Lawrence and help him.
Making the situation more explosive was a wave of religious fundamentalism spreading among the Algonquin people. They were listening to a religious radical, a visionary from the Delaware Nation named Nealon.
The dream vision that he had of this whole situation was that everyone should go back to their basics, get rid of their guns, go back to bows and arrows and stone axes, and get rid of these red dogs with hair on their face.
Pontiac became an apostle of Nealon, but adapting Nealon's message to his own ends. Pontiac's vision saw not all white men as evil, just the English.
The children of your great father, the King of France, are not like the English. Never forget that they are your brothers. They are very dear to me, for they love the red man.
The stage is now set for an uprising that will shake the British to their foundations. Not far from Fort Detroit in April 1763, Pontiac gathers principal tribes of the Algonquin Confederacy. They agree to his plan for a holy war against the British.
These English, these dogs dressed in red, who have come to rob you of your hunting grounds and drive away the game. You must lift the hatchet against them. Wipe them from the face of the earth. Then you will win my favor back again and once more be happy and prosperous.
With great deliberation, Pontiac sets his strategy in motion, dispatching couriers across the wilderness with a plan of astonishing boldness, coordinated in a way Indians have never done before. There will be simultaneous strikes against a chain of British forts strung across the frontier. The first attacks come against Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph, and Fort Miamis. The uprising is launched in May and is so well coordinated, it prompts disbelief at British Supreme Headquarters.
A dispatch just in, sir. That on May 16th, Fort Sandusky fell to the Indians, Hurons and Ottawas.
I believe none of this. The Indians are not capable of such operations.
On May 25, Potawatomis from Detroit assaulted Fort St. Joseph and killed or captured all of its defenders. On May 27, a war party from Detroit captured Fort Miamis.
Any post commanded by a British officer can certainly never be in danger from such a wretched enemy as the Indians are if the garrisons do their duty.
Their ranger, Robert Rogers, a North American with long experience fighting with and against Indians, sees peril where Amherst doesn't.
Their scheme seems to have been projected with much deliberate mischief in the intention, and more than the usual skill in the system of execution.
Now Pontiac's rebellion looks to the north. At the junction of two great lakes stood Fort Michilimackinac. It is of strategic importance, controlling the fur trade over a vast region. Here will come an attack catching the imagination of history. The fort is on the shoreline, stoutly built of cedar logs and stretching over 2 acres. Rogers observes that it is highly vulnerable to attack.
It was weakly garrisoned, and unable to obtain the least intelligence.
The lucrative fur trade at the fort, with the British now paying for furs half what the French used to, drew many a young man looking to make a fortune. But one new arrival was put on his guard by the behavior of the Indians. Alexander Henry thought it strange they wanted no trinkets, only weapons.
The Indians came in great numbers into the fort, purchasing tomahawks, frequently desiring to see silver armbands and other precious ornaments, of which I had a large quantity for sale. These ornaments, however, were in no instance purchased. They left them, saying they would call again the next day.
Henry reported his suspicions to the post commander, but his fears about the Indians were dismissed. The next afternoon, a lacrosse game, the game Indians call the little brother of war. On this day, it's a Trojan horse. Pontiac's allies declare they are staging the match in honor of the king's birthday. British soldiers come out to bet on the two teams, the Sauk and the Chippewa. In the heat of the game, the ball gets tossed over the wall of the fort. The Indians chase after it, suddenly pulling out their weapons.
I saw a crowd of Indians within the fort, furiously cutting down every Englishman they found. I saw several of my countrymen fall, and more than one struggling between the knees of an Indian, who, holding him in this manner, scalped him while yet living. Amid the slaughter, I observed many of the Canadian inhabitants of the fort calmly looking on, neither opposing the Indians or suffering injury. I asked one of them for help. He looked for a moment at me, and then, shrugging his shoulders and intimating that he could do nothing for me. Que voudriez-vous que j'en ferais? What do you want me to do about it?
Fulfilling Pontiac's wishes, the warriors left the French alone, but 17 British soldiers and 1 fur trader were dead back at the fort. The British called it a massacre, but Pontiac's warriors thought they won fair and square. So does their descendant, Charlie Myers.
The fort in Michilimackinac went down very easy. Because the Indians won, it was a great massacre. Of course, there weren't that many people killed.
But the fall of Fort Michilimackinac finally wakes Amherst up.
It would seem the affair is more general than I had once apprehended.
But Sir Geoffrey is confident that British superiority will carry the day.
Fire!
For Pontiac, the fort on the Detroit River is a crucial target. The biggest on the frontier, nearly a kilometer around, with bastions at 3 corners. commanded by Major Henry Gladwin, a canny frontier officer who is about to be tested. Pontiac plans a peace mission to the fort with a small army of warriors, confident of fooling the British like at Michilimackinac. On the 7th of May, 1763, Pontiac and his warriors cross the Detroit River by canoe and enter the fort's east gate.
The Indians actually came into the fort with their rifles under their blankets, and they had spent time shortening the rifles so that they were easier to conceal. But Major Gladwin had been warned that something was afoot and was ready for them. Pontiac was supposed to flip a wampum belt as a signal to take over, but he realized he was outnumbered, and this didn't happen.
We are greatly surprised, brother, at this unusual step you have taken to have all the soldiers under arms. We imagine some bad bird has given you ill news of us. Do not believe, my brother, for they are bad birds who want to stir you up against your brothers, the Indians.
Pontiac and his men leave the fort to make a new plan. Gladwin never reveals how he learned of the plot, but legend has the warning coming from one of Pontiac's tribe with whom Gladwin is having an affair.
Pontiac actually beat her with a lacrosse stick and let her live, but a few years later she got drunk and fell into a maple syrup pot and drowned.
Fort Detroit is safe for the moment. The crisis seems to be passing. The fort's commandant, Major Gladwin, sent a dispatch to his commander-in-chief dismissing any threat from Pontiac.
Gladwin writes that the Indians do not possess the patience for siege warfare, and the crisis will soon pass. All this mischief is greatly owing to some disaffected Canadians, seconded by French traders. They've made the Indians believe that there is a French army and fleet coming up the St. Lawrence River and from Illinois. How would you credit it?
Pontiac isn't finished with the British at Detroit. His warriors begin a series of attacks on British vessels trying to supply the fort. In the first week alone, they kill or capture 50 British soldiers and crew. And surprising the British, Fort Detroit is now under siege by Pontiac's Odawa and Wyandot warriors. But first doubts about French intentions come to the fore. Pontiac dispatches a letter to the commandant of the French garrison in the west, saying, "How come you never write?"
Est-il possible que notre père n'écrive jamais? Sommes-nous abandonnés? Les Anglais disent continuellement, nous sommes les maîtres de ces terres et de tout ce qui a appartenu à votre père, car nous l'avons vaincu. Nous avons prié notre père, l'Illinois, pour qu'il se hâte à nous secourir. C'est que nous ne voulons point que les Anglais détiennent ces terres. Voilà ce qui pousse vos enfants à se soulever et à attaquer partout.
In rapid succession, new attacks are launched. Fort Ligonier, Fort Pitt, Fort Ouiatenon, Fort Venago, Fort Le Boeuf, and Fort Presqu'île. Fort Edward Augustus is abandoned in panic.
There are 12 British forts in the Indian Territory. 8 have been captured, and others abandoned, and 2 are under siege.
They have lost their fear of us.
Pontiac!
Go!
Pontiac and the Algonquin Confederacy have reason to celebrate. They have accomplished what no other Indian nation has ever done. They humbled the British army that had vanquished France. Even French-Canadian allies are surprised at the success. Perhaps Canada can be saved for France after all. Everywhere the Indian triumph puts the fear of God into British settlers.
The news struck all America with consternation and depopulated a great part of our frontiers.
The British finally moved to the offensive. Amherst dispatches his protege, Captain James Dalyell, with orders to gather up reinforcements.
You are for Detroit. You'll proceed by way of Albany, Oswego, and Niagara, collecting up everything that can be spared. This is extremely inconvenient, but we must be prepared for the worst that the Indians can do.
I will punish the miscreants.
Dalyell's expedition reaches Fort Niagara, still in British hands, then sails across Lake Erie, reaching Fort Detroit under cover of a fog on the 28th of July, 1763. Major Gladwin is dismayed with Dalyell, who didn't bring much in the way of badly needed supplies, but did bring a hunger for glory. With almost no experience fighting on the frontier, Amherst's man declares he is going to conduct an immediate night assault on Pontiac's camp and give the savages a proper beating. At 2:30 in the morning on 31st of July, Dalyell leads a force of 247 British soldiers out of the fort and through the fields, confident of catching Pontiac sleeping. Pontiac is not sleeping. At a place now called Bloody Run, Pontiac and his warriors wait in ambush. The fighting is fierce. Shot off his horse, Dalyell and 19 of his men died fighting. Afterwards, Dalyell's head is impaled on a stake, and as a tribute, his heart is cut out and eaten by Pontiac's warriors.
Normally people were eaten if they were extremely strong. Had a very strong arm, they'd eat the muscle out of his arm. A fast runner, the calf out of his leg. If he was just gutsy and hard to deal with, they'd eat his heart. So, but this is kind of a religious thing to get that power themselves.
At British headquarters, Amherst takes Dalyell's death as a personal affront.
I must sensibly lament the loss of a worthy man and most excellent officer. The Indians are more allied to the brute than to human creation. Should any of the villains be met in arms, I wish to hear of no prisoners.
Amherst's attempt to impose British rule on the Indian nations, first by starvation, then by force of arms, has failed terribly. Now Sir Geoffrey is ordering the murder of prisoners, and worse.
Could it not be contrived to send smallpox among the disaffected tribes of the region?
Today, it's called biological warfare.
You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race.
No disease filled people with more dread than smallpox. It was extremely infectious, and there was no cure. It was a plague that mutilated before it killed. Blankets infected with smallpox were distributed as gifts to Pontiac's allies, the Delaware Nation around Fort Pitt. By the time the epidemic is over, thousands are scarred and 200 are dead. It is a war crime, one of Lord Geoffrey's Indian policies, the first recorded instance of biological warfare in North America. But it does not break Pontiac's spirit. Every fort on the frontier is either burned to the ground, abandoned, or desperately trying to break the siege. The continuous intensity of the attacks surprises even Rogers.
I had no cannon, nor understanding of the methods of siege, yet with incredible boldness and astonishing patience they continue day to day, pouring in a storm of musketry and fire arrows, hoping at length by famine, by fire, or by harassing out the garrison, to carry their point.
At Detroit, the siege is in its 175th day. With the supply situation grim, Major Gladwin writes in despair, "I wish I had quit the service years ago and that somebody else commanded here." Pontiac has done all in his power to clear the way for the return of France to the wilderness. Just as he seems to be winning, devastating news comes wrapped in diplomatic niceties. On the 20th of October, 1763, a courier arrives from a French commander on the Mississippi.
Enfants des Français, nation des Grands Lacs, le maître de la vie a inspiré votre père, le grand roi des Français, et son frère, le grand roi des Anglais, afin qu'ils fassent la paix. Dès aujourd'hui, chefs et guerriers doivent enterrer la hachette de guerre. Votre joie sera grande en voyant les Français et les Anglais fumant au même calumet, mangeant à la même écuelle, vivant enfin comme des frères.
Now the Indian nations begin to desert Pontiac's cause. In the end, Pontiac accepts the inevitable, dispatching this letter to his nemesis, the fortunate commander of Fort Detroit.
Mon frère, la parole que mon père a envoyée pour faire la paix, je l'accepte. Tous mes jeunes guerriers ont enterré l'âge de guerre. Je pense que tu oublieras les mauvaises actions qui se sont passées il y a quelque temps, et de même, j'oublierai ce que tu peux m'avoir fait. Pontiac.
General Amherst is recalled to England under a cloud. His draconian policies toward the Indian nations failed miserably. His policies were designed to save money. They ended costing a war, the lives of 400 English soldiers, 2,000 white settlers, and a king's ransom to finally extinguish. He is now going home, not to a hero's welcome for beating the French, but to explain himself for defeat at the hands of a chief he called a wretched savage. The British took revenge on Pontiac slowly. They promised to honor him as a chief of the Algonquin people. Instead, they found ways to undermine and humiliate him, setting the stage where his own people would do what British war and repression had failed to do, bring Pontiac down.
In '69, Pontiac was down in St. Louis and over at Cahokia, and someone was bribed with a barrel of rum to kill him.
On the 20th of April, 1769, wearing the royal uniform given him by McCallum, Pontiac is assassinated by a Peorian Indian he thought a comrade. Pontiac's uprising failed to bring back France, but it had revolutionary repercussions. His insurrection forced the British to reverse their radical policies and recognize Indian sovereignty over a vast territory. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 created an Indian country stretching from the Mississippi in the west to the new province of Quebec in the east. This new territory was ordered kept clear of white settlers. This enraged white settler society, the American colonies, and a dozen years later helped set the stage for an even greater rebellion against the British, the American Revolution. Among many things, Pontiac had showed the colonists that the Redcoats were not invincible.